The New World Order. You may remember that phrase from, I think it was a little bit after the 1991 U.S. war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the Desert Storm, where after that war was over and the Soviet Union collapsed almost right afterwards, then President George Bush said, we are embarking on a new world order. And now then everything is going to be great. Just didn't quite work out that way. Now then, there is a new world order that is emerging, one that which most Americans are not aware, and that most American policymakers really seem to have no idea how to respond to. But we are going to bring someone in that can help you understand exactly what is going on, what the risks and the dangers are, and most importantly, what we could do about it to either forestall it or at least to mitigate some of the bad. And that is former Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, Danny.
Well, listen, this you and I were communicating via email about a week or so ago, and it's one of the things that spawned the desire for this show here is that you were talking about some of the things that Putin is doing, not just in one country, but really across the board. That kind of looks like they're trying to change the dynamics of the existing world order that really has been not just since World War II, but especially since that Desert Storm time when George Bush said, hey, this is going to be a new world order. And I'm curious because I think you were actually in government in Saudi Arabia as the ambassador at that time. What did you think at the moment of his declaration that there's a new world order on the stage?
Well, I will immodestly say that he picked that phrase out of a very short telegram I sent him on the Iraqi invasion and occupation of Kuwait, in which I argued that we could not allow the post-Cold War order to begin by condoning the occupation and annexation of a smaller country by a larger one, and that what we had to defend was not only our strategic position in relation to the Persian Gulf's oil supplies, but also the rule of law, the UN Charter and the principles we had fought for in World War II and espoused during the Cold War. And so I argued, I used the phrase New World Order. He then picked it up, and it was promptly distorted by other people as something meaning hegemony by the United States. It did not mean that.
Wow, I had no idea.
And so this is a footnote on history, if you will. But the irony is that what we were trying to fight for during that war in terms of defending the values of the UN Charter and international law has all been turned on its head. By whom? By us. We are the ones who have ignored the Charter, invaded various countries unilaterally, separated, we vivisected Serbia, the former Yugoslavia, and took out Kosovo, and set a precedent for the Russians to do the same in Crimea to Ukraine. So ironically, what we fought for, you were part of that military exercise, as I was in Riyadh enjoying the night sky full of scuds coming down on me. What we fought for, we have ended up betraying, basically.
Wow, that is so disappointing.
What is Mr. Putin doing? He and many others now associated in the BRICS grouping, which has expanded and includes countries like Saudi Arabia now. By the way, the Saudi defense minister is in Beijing as we speak. This is part of the new order that is emerging. Nobody is prepared to accept the overlordship of another country, not the United States, not China, not Russia, not India. Countries want to be independent and to chart their own course. And the BRICS grouping is trying to defend the values of the UN Charter. Why? Because the purpose of law is to protect the weak from the strong. And the alternative to international law, meaning a legal order that subjects both the rule makers and those subject to the rules to the same principles, the alternative for this is what Thucydides quoted the Athenians as telling the millions in the Peloponnesian War, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. And this is not a principle that we should want to see enshrined anywhere, but it is pretty much what is operating at the moment. And ironically, we are on the wrong side of this at the moment. We
Now,
are the strong who are doing, and we are doing, for example, in conjunction with Israel in Gaza and Palestine, we are demonstrating that we have no fidelity to the principles we claim to.
now, I would argue that really since Desert Storm and the dissolution of the USSR, that we have been able to just unilaterally do whatever we wanted, no matter what anybody thought. And I always remember you're talking about when we're trying to coerce adversaries or just outright attack people. But I think it also started maybe earlier in that period or in the middle part of it. In the early 2000s, when we were going to make that invasion into the second invasion into Iraq in the 2003 war. And I always remember that there was such strenuous opposition from especially France and Germany to our occupation, to our war, that Bush was just bullheadedly going through there. And I just remember he just completely embarrassed them and humiliated them and said, yeah, don't care what any of y'all are saying. We're going to do whatever we want. And it seemed to me that was planting the seeds of continued just, I don't care what anybody thinks. We're going to do what we want, i.e. not law-based, but rules-based that we set for you, not for me.
Yeah, we make the rules and we issue the orders. That's our current practice. And you're right. George W. Bush campaigned on a platform of a more humble conservatism. That was what he argued he was going to deliver. He delivered quite the opposite. I can remember you mentioned opposition to the war in the invasion of Iraq. I can remember being called by the father of the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf, a retired admiral who was working with the World Affairs Council in Norfolk, Virginia. He asked me if I would come down and talk about the impending war invasion of Iraq. And I said, well, I'm sorry to tell you that if I do, I will be opposed to it. I will make the argument against it. And he said, that's exactly what we want to hear. And I went down there. There was an evening event, about 300 people, couples mainly, all associated with what was then USACOM and the Atlantic Fleet headquarters, SACLAN. I got a standing ovation. And next day I went over to the USACOM headquarters, and they had been charged to plan the occupation, they were aghast. So I think it wasn't just some people in the political sphere who thought this was crazy. The military who were charged with implementing it thought it was crazy, and they were told by Rumsfeld to shut up and don't pay any attention to previous interagency planning that had been done. Just go forward. And they were told by Condi Rice, who was then the National Security Advisor, that the war would pay for itself, and that and that we would be greeted with flowers and dancing as the liberators of Iraq. Well, I think you had some experience which was contrary to that, and it's not that our national security establishment is brain dead, but a lot of our politicians are.
And let me ask you, at that point, let's say by the summer of 2003, early 2004, what was the consequences of our completely ignoring all of our allies? And in the terms of what was the view on our allies, and then what was the impact on our potential adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, et cetera, when they see that we can't be constrained?
Well, I think there were multiple impacts. On the one hand, our oldest ally, of course, is France, and we had a complete falling out with the French. And you may remember the Congress, which, in its wisdom, renamed French fries freedom fries.
I do remember that.
It's just about the dumbest, most laughable thing that they could possibly have come up with. It makes us look like utter fools internationally. And in the end, we had what we called the coalition of the billing. Unlike the 1991 liberation of Kuwait, which was under a UN auspices and which had the full support of the whole world, the best we could do was assemble a ragtag group of about 1/4 of the world's nations, a lot of them there to strap hang on us and pick up cheap equipment and training and ingratiate themselves with us. Some of them flatly just paid to do that, and it didn't work out too well. So basically, we left the first Gulf War in 1991 at the top of the world's most admired nation. Our military had proven its competence. That greatly impressed the Russians, the Chinese, and others. We left the invasion of Iraq and the failure in Afghanistan with our reputation in tatters, both politically and militarily. And if you think any country now wants the United States to come in and, quote, liberate it from its internal political order, just ask, take a look at what the Iraqis have suffered as a result of this, or the Afghans. We don't have any credibility anymore. So this is, the final point, however, is the display that we put on really in the first Gulf War so impressed the Chinese that they launched a major military modernization program that they had not undertaken. The military had been number 4 in their list of priorities, with agriculture and economic matters way up in the list. And it moved to the top. And the result is the China that we see now, which is technologically formidable and, of course, inexperienced in major warfare. I imagine they're learning a lot from the battles in Ukraine.
Yep.
But on the other hand, we haven't fought a regular army with air control since 1945. We're in a situation that where there are no rules. Apparently, the Russians clearly broke any rules that did exist when they went into Ukraine, and we're now inching up on a showdown with Moscow over nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and that's where I want to actually shift to. So basically, from the picture you've drawn from 1991, made a big stumble, but it started off good in 1991, made a huge stumble in 2003, and I would argue that by 2021, when we left Afghanistan in such a disastrous way, again, I think that you could say our reputation was even more in tatters and shambled at that point. But then the next year, everything that we've done, first of all, with the Russia-Ukraine war, and then now with the Hezbollah, I'm sorry, hopefully that's not a slip of the tongue, Hamas-Israeli war, now it's just an outright free fall, I think. And I want to show a few things here and kind of get your opinion on really what this new emerging world, new world order might look like, and what you see for me. Because if we were just in tatters before, now then, because of what we've been pushing, it appears to me that we're helping compel others to form something that's antithetical to our interests. And the first one I want to point up here is probably the obvious one, is the Russia-China. Now, they've been in various degrees of working together for quite a number of years, but really in the recent months, even, it seems to be getting a lot more significant. And I don't know if you could just talk about what that's doing and how that's developing as a result of what we've been doing.
Well, it is, of course, the case that China and the predecessor to the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union, actually fought a war on their borders, and this in the late 60s. And this is what led us to normalize relations with China and to enlist them in the containment of the Soviet Union. And it took 25 years from the moment when the Chinese and the Russians fell out for them to rediscover the importance of having a cooperative relationship. I remember in 1995, sorry, in Beijing, asking for a briefing from the Chinese military on what their strategy for dealing with Russia was. And they said, Russia's down, but it will come back. We think it'll take another 10 years, 2005. They'll be again on the upsurge. And we want to make sure that when they are on the upsurge, we are their friend and we cooperate, and we are not, again, their enemy. And they persisted in that. They've had a strategy very clearly for all this time. We've had no strategy at all. The Cold War ended. We had spent $3 trillion on the Cold War. We wouldn't spend anything on helping Russia take a new course. The only thing we spent money on was nuclear threat reduction, which is good, but that is not a basis for a positive relationship. The basic premise of it is negative. That is, that we're potential enemies. We don't do nuclear threat reduction with the British or even the French. So we did not build a positive relationship or cooperative relationship with post-Cold War Russia. And we're now paying a price for that. Instead, we adopted what was increasingly a purely military approach. We expanded NATO to Russia's borders. We retrained and re-equipped the Ukrainian army against Russia while promising an entry into NATO. And here we are. We have no diplomatic or political strategy at all. There is no strategy for ending the war in Ukraine on any terms, favorable or unfavorable. There is no strategy for ending the war between Israel and the Palestinians. I don't want to accept I don't think this is a war between Israel and Hamas. I think it's a war by Israel to get rid of Palestinians. And they happen to have a very nationalist and somewhat unscrupulous group leading them, that is Hamas. And now, as you mentioned in your Freudian slip, we face the prospect of Israel launching a war on Hezbollah in Lebanon. And there I want to just make one point. All the talk in our press is about the 60 or 80,000, I think it's 80,000 Israelis who had to move from the north of Israel, who've been dislocated by the border conflict with Hezbollah, which Hezbollah has launched in support of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Nobody talks about the 90,000 Lebanese who've had to move, who've been dislocated by Israeli bombing and attacks, since Israel has complete control of the air over Lebanon. Nobody talks about them at all. Our view of these situations is entirely one-sided and therefore inaccurate. And Hezbollah has made it clear from the beginning that it would stop any action against Israel if Israel ceased fire in Gaza. Israel has no interest in that. Mr. Netanyahu, contrary to what the administration has claimed, has not signed on to a peace proposal. His position is, he has two positions. One, I will accept a temporary ceasefire in return for the return of some of the hostages. But I reserve the right to resume the war immediately thereafter. And number two, we intend to hunt down and kill every Hamas leader wherever they are. Now, tell me what kind of a peace proposal that is.
Right. So you're telling me, okay, Hamas, what I want you to do is stop fighting, give us back any leverage you have, and then we're going to come kill you. What's not to like about that?
Well, exactly. They seem to be going after Ismail Haniyeh, the political head of Hamas's family. They killed his kids, his grandchildren. The other day, they killed his sister. How is this a peace policy? I would say it's anything but. Now we have Benny Gantz saying, oh, we have the ability to just take out Hezbollah, like they haven't managed in 8 months to take out Hamas. So there's something really crazy about going on in that place. And we're
And the
supporting it.
fact that I think that the fact that we're so feckless and powerless to affect anything that our erstwhile ally Israel does, I think further diminishes our global standing and gives impetus to this emerging new world order. Is that fair to
Well,
say?
indeed. No, I do think you're correct that our stance on these issues, which is anathema to much of the world, is in fact driving coalitions to form against us. The BRICS is one such. It began as basically a protest movement against American dictatorship over world affairs. It's now emerged as something with actual programs and policies. And interestingly, this year it's under Russian chairmanship, and they are working very hard on mechanisms to replace the dollar internationally as the mechanism for trade settlement, which, if they succeed, will be devastating for us. So
Now, I kind of along that lines in economics here. So we just saw there that Putin is moving, closer to China, but that's not his only move here internationally. He's gone on the move quite a bit. Also in Vietnam, he just signed a lot of economic deals with Vietnam. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that does in his bigger strategy, how that fits in with Putin, and maybe even what he's trying to do with all of these nations.
Well, I think let's put all this in context. In response to the American loosening of restrictions on Ukraine's strikes deep into Russia with American weapons, and particularly the strike on Sevastopol's beach, which killed a bunch of people and wounded 150 civilians, and strikes deep into Russia at refineries and so forth. Mr. Putin's response is, I could respond with nuclear weapons, but I'm not going to at this stage. Instead, what I'm going to do is adopt a policy of actively arming the enemies of the United States. And you didn't clarify whether that just meant states or whether it also meant non-state actors. But his first implementation of this policy was to establish a relationship of mutual support with North Korea. This is in part a manifestation of deficiencies in the Russian economy because North Korea can supply a huge amount of ammunition and artillery for Russian artillery, which is the key to its steady advances in the Ukrainian battlefield. But it is ominous in the sense that in previous years, Russia was part of the process of trying to denuclearize North Korea. It was supportive of US policy. It was not against it. And Japan and South Korea, as well as the United States, benefited from that. Now, Russia's declared itself on the other side, and it's withdrawn its objections to the nuclear program in North Korea, which, as a result of our so-called maximum pressure policy, has led the North Koreans to develop ICBMs with nuclear warheads that can strike anywhere in the United States. And apparently they did this with some Russian support as part of the turn toward outright enmity between the United States and Russia. And then he went to Vietnam. And the purpose of going to Vietnam basically is to rebuild Russian influence there, which was, of course, very great. It was the Russians more than anyone that fought us by proxy in the Vietnam War. They armed the North. They supplied the weapons. They did the training. And there's a long history of relations between Russia and the Vietnamese. People don't remember that when the Japanese and the Russians went to war at the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian fleet that traveled all the way around the world to be sunk at Tsushima, the strait between Japan and South Korea, stopped and refueled and refreshed itself at Cam Bay, which was then, of course, under the French. So I think what we're seeing is an effort by Russia to rebuild a relationship with Vietnam, which will compete with us. They had not been competing with us. And they're doing this probably to the displeasure of the Chinese.
Mm.
So this is an indication that, Russia may be using the relationship with China to its advantage in its confrontation with us, but it's not under the Chinese thumb, nor is China under the Russian thumb. And so I don't suppose the Chinese are too happy about the Russians establishing a position of primacy in North Korea. I don't suppose they'll be too happy about the Russians regaining the sort of influence they're obviously gunning for in Hanoi.
And let me ask you along those same lines. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 2015 joint nuclear deal that we did with Iran, Russia was relatively supportive of that too, if I'm not mistaken. And now you see that is completely turned on its ear with Russia getting weapons from Iran.
Yes, I mean, what we've done is we've built a little coalition of arms producers, now including North Korea, Iran, China, Russia. Chinese have been the only ones who won't provide Russia with weapons. So we complain that they provide them with components that the Russians turn into weapons. But, we should be thankful for the fact that the Chinese, in fact, have not entered this fray. They have maintained neutrality. They've kept normal trade relations. For the most part, they've respected our financial sanctions. Chinese banks have been very cautious in dealing with the Russians. Of course, I think they look forward to the disappearance of the dollar in their trade with Russia. And in fact, 90% of their trade with Russia is now dollar free. But the question for the Chinese is, if you facilitate more trade financially through banks with the Russians, will the U.S. Then put sanctions on you elsewhere in the world? And the answer to that is this project that they're working on to make sure that there are alternatives to the dollar everywhere. And we'll probably see that. There's a BRICS summit coming up at Kazan, I believe, before long, and we may see a development on this. Anyway,
let me ask you this question. In just a second, I'm going to look at what the U.S. has done to try and address all of these issues here. But before I do that, I wonder if you could kind of speak kind of generally about all of these developments. Where do you see them going? And is it already too late to stop it? Is the momentum so great that at some point, whether it's BRICS or de-dollarization or whatever, that there's going to be a new orbit that's not going to change anymore, at least in the foreseeable future?
I don't think we're going to go back to the previous position of global leadership. I don't think anybody at this point trusts us. I'm sorry to say that our spokespeople at the White House, the State Department, Pentagon, they now have a reputation for outright lies and denial of stuff that everybody can see. So we see genocide going on in Xinjiang, where people are being re-educated in camps. Actually, that program's probably ended now. But we can't see it in Gaza. We don't have any credibility. The second point is, if you put your future in our hands, look what happened in Afghanistan. Look what happened in Iraq. And by the way, it appears that Hamas political leadership is leaving Qatar, partly because we threatened Qatar for harboring it, and moving to where? Iraq. Like the war in Iraq really accomplished something for our influence in Iraq. What is all this the product of? It is the product of a diplomacy-free foreign policy, a policy which has no strategy and no diplomatic implementation, even on the tactical level. Everything we do is military. And we imagine, and you mentioned Iran. There's an incredible example. After we tore up the agreement that had been endorsed by the UN Security Council, everybody, the Chinese, the Russians, and everybody else, and which kept Iranian nuclear weapons development off the table. We tore that up, and Iran is now doing we don't know what. And we know one thing. Meantime, we're offering apparently some kind of nuclear program to Saudi Arabia. Well, the Saudis are not going to accept restrictions that don't apply to the Iranians or the
Right.
Israelis. So we've just managed to bumble around and create more problems than we need to confront.
And where would you say that this is going on the international level in terms of reforming a world order, say the next 10 years?
Well, people talk about multipolarity, multipolar orders. I don't like that word because it's two-dimensional. I mean, a pole is something with two ends in a line. And I think the correct word is multinodal. A node is something that connects to other nodes three-dimensionally. You could have any kind of connection, a big one, a little one, a tenuous one, a new one, an old one. And I think the world is becoming multinodal. And we are just one of the nodes now. We are no longer in charge of the whole thing. And when we go around saying that the whole world is engaged in two things, a battle between democracy and authoritarianism. Well, interestingly, Ukraine, which is under martial law, suspended elections, banned all its political parties, took over all the public media, is actually less democratic than Russia these days. So where is this operative? And second, and our great friend India is drifting away into an authoritarian mode, right? And second, we say, well, it's all about great power rivalry. Is that what's happening in Gaza? Is it great power rivalry, or is it the strong doing what they can and the weak suffering what they must? So I don't think we understand the world. I think the Biden administration has got it completely wrong. That is not what is happening. And what is happening is the formation of varying coalitions, nodes, connecting to nodes, many of which exclude us. In fact, almost all of them do. Look at East Asia, the Pacific Asia. There was something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we sponsored, was originally invented not by us, but by others. But we picked it up, took it over, and then we walked away from it. What's the result? The result is we have absolutely no role in developing trade and investment relations in Pacific Asia. We're aced out. Who's in there? China is at the center of it. There is something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. We're not in it. The Japanese took over TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and they're now the leaders in that. Well, they're our friends, of course. Anyway, we beat them in World War II, and they've been with us ever since. But we have basically forfeited our leadership. And I don't see it. I'm looking around the world. I don't see, even in NATO, which we claim we have reunited, and indeed it's pulled together under the pressure of the war in Ukraine, to some extent. You have countries like Hungary, which actually is now going to be the president of the European Union for 6 months, which don't agree with us. Slovakia doesn't agree with us. The French obviously have a different view, quite an aggressive one under Macron.
Yeah,
Turkey is something to do with why he lost the recent elections. But anyway, Europe is not united behind our policies or with us. Everybody there is engaging in hedging. The German defense budget doubling is a product of that. Would you want to rely on the United States when you don't know who's going to be president at the end of this year or beginning of next year, and whether that person, we just have seen the advisors to Mr. Trump, the almost certain Republican candidate, say that his policy will be to, on day one, to tell Zelensky and the Ukrainians, no more weapons until you negotiate. Well, maybe that's sensible, but it's a hell of an erratic performance by us. And this is the thing. we seem to be immune to consideration of foreign interests or to the value of our own consistency, and
Right.
our
So,
everything
so,
is
so,
driven
so
by
let me ask you,
domestic politics.
since the like it has existed at the when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1992, there will be no more, sole nuclear or sole superpower like we had then for a while. And there's not even going to be really a bipolar world with us and then everybody else. So that's gone, and I think nothing never coming back. So in this nodal framework that you're talking about, what can the United States do to maintain, peace, a good economy, and a good relation with everybody? What can we do since we're not going to be the sole guy anymore? What ought to we to do?
Well, I think we should rediscover diplomacy. We have enormous influence potentially. We have a very, very large economy now, the second largest in the world behind China, but still very large. Access to our market is important. It's a source of influence by us to others. If we cut off that access, which is what we're proposing to do with protectionist measures, we just lose influence. We have the most powerful military in the world. If we used it cautiously and sensibly, it would be a major asset. If we use it everywhere promiscuously, it's not only foolish, but counterproductive. We have the dollar as the universal mechanism of trade settlement. Why are we jeopardizing that by putting sanctions on everyone and trying to, when the Bretton Woods deal was done after World War II, which created the supremacy of the dollar, the premise was that the dollar would be neutral, not politicized, that it would be a neutral, fair mechanism for settling trade and therefore for providing reserves to maintain value internationally. We've now thoroughly politicized it. We have sanctions on 1/3 of the world at the moment. This is cutting us off from the world, not enhancing our influence. So there are lots of things we could do. Look at what we've done, for example, with some of the new institutions that have grown up to supplement Bretton Woods institutions. There was, of course, after World War II, a mechanism created at Bretton Woods to put the dollar on top. We created the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the IBRD, and then we refused to expand them as the rest of the world developed to meet the needs, infrastructure building and other needs, loans that other countries need. We refused consistently. And so the Chinese and others have created other institutions. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example. We told everybody not to join that. Everybody did, except us and Japan. That's foolish. There's an old American adage, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And we are on the menu everywhere.
Well, and I want to look at a couple of reasons of why that's the case. So I just asked you what we ought to do, and you laid out a very cogent, coherent, and rational plan of what we ought to do. Here's what we are doing. So first of all, I want to look at what General Pat Ryder said, I think it was yesterday, to announce that the United States, for the first time in over a year, has talked to the Russian Minister of Defense. But it's a little odd what he said. Watch this.
Secretary Austin also spoke by phone today with Russian Minister of Defense Andrei Belousov. During the call, the secretary emphasized the importance of maintaining lines of communication amid Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. The last time Secretary Austin spoke to his Russian counterpart, then Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu, was on March 15, 2023. A brief readout will be posted to defense.gov.
And there is that brief readout, which basically says they talked on the phone. Doesn't say anything at all. So number one, we don't talk very often. And then we don't know what happened behind the scenes, of course, but this just doesn't have a good look to me.
What if this is like the pattern with the Chinese? This is We talk and we don't listen. There's no two-way communication. We get on the phone and we talk, and we don't listen. That is not communication. That is hectoring, and that is not diplomacy. That doesn't solve anything. If you don't listen to the other guy, you won't understand why he takes the position he does. If you just say, well, he's irrational, all you're saying is, I'm not going to bother to take the time to figure out why he's thinking what he's thinking. So I'm just going to write him off. Well, that isn't communication. What is it that we are offering anybody in these phone calls? Are we proposing to trade something for something? Are we suggesting we might change our behavior if they do? No. We're just telling them you're wrong and we're right. And that is not a formula to produce much of anything.
And here's one of the other things we're doing. You mentioned earlier in this show that some of our official spokesmen say things that just make us look, even worse and undercut our ability to influence things. Here's one example of that. So over the weekend, as most people know by now, there was an incident on the beach in Sevastopol. It's where a lot of Russian beachgoers on a religious holiday were hit with what appears to be an American ATACMS missile with submunitions that hit the beach, killed a number of people, wounded over 150, I think is the last number I saw. And so the U.S. ambassador was summoned to the Kremlin to explain this. Now, when asked about it, Matthew Miller had this to say.
I've seen the comments from the government of Moscow. I think they pertain to the reported strike in Crimea. I will just tell you what the ambassador said when she met with the Russian Foreign Ministry, and that is, of course, that we lament any civilian loss of life in this war. We provide weapons to Ukraine so it can defend its sovereign territory against armed aggression. That includes in Crimea, which of course is part of Ukraine. And Russia could stop this war today and end the suffering caused by the war Russia launched today if it would stop its occupation of sovereign Ukrainian territory and stop launching attacks on civilians.
So instead of even addressing that an American bomb killed a bunch of beachgoers, he just immediately pivots to mocking Russia and saying, yeah, they can just leave. And you're going to see, because there's a few more clips I got here in a minute, that mocking term is something that is consistent with our senior officials.
Look, my response to Mr. Putin is this. If you're so worried about becoming the victim of attacks, and you're worried about your troops' livelihoods and your military units, then get the hell out of Ukraine. You don't have any business being in there in the first place. That's my best advice to Mr. Putin.
And I'm sure Mr. Putin says, oh, thanks, John. Appreciate that.
Yeah, they could. Well, I mean, I think Mr. Putin would say in return, get your troops out of Ukraine. That's basically what NATO enlargement was producing. And the notion that there aren't any American troops in Ukraine is crazy. There have been trainers there for the past 10 years. And so this is just getting us nowhere. This is like I look at the Israel-Hamas dialogue, and we're saying, Hamas, you've got to accept a ceasefire. Well, is Hamas the one that's conducting the aggressive operations at this point? I don't believe so. Is Ukraine using weapons to attack Russian beaches behind our back? We're not part of it. ATACMS cannot be targeted without us. And maybe there's a Ukrainian finger that presses the button, but everything prior to that is coordinated with the U.S. Look at those cluster bombs coming down. That is really something.
And no concern at all, other than just this kind of marginal, we regret innocent life everywhere, but nothing about, the fact that it was our weapons that did this. Nothing, not even talking about possibly, well, we're going to do an investigation, find out what happened with it. It was a terrible, nothing at all. Just, Russia, it's your fault anyway. So it really doesn't matter. In a similar vein, here was Pat Ryder again, when asked a question about potential for North Korean soldiers to enter this. Here's how he responded.
You're asking, what do I think about Russia assigning North Korean forces to the battlefield in Ukraine? Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something to keep an eye on. I think that if I were North Korean military personnel management, I would be questioning my choices on sending my forces to be cannon fodder in an illegal war against Ukraine. And we've seen the kinds of casualties that Russian forces. But again, something that we'll keep an eye on.
So again, just kind of a mocking thing this time to North Korea. That, I wouldn't do that if I were you. You're going to get killed or whatever. No answers, no response at all, and that seems consistent on almost any subject we look at.
We're very good at stonewalling, which is what we're doing. And this is tragic because we should be thinking about how to end these conflicts. The fact that what we're doing is increasing the danger of conflict now on the Korean Peninsula, as well as in the Middle East, and an escalation and counter-escalation process going on between us and the Russians. And I would remind you that in that cycle of escalation and counter-escalation, both sides have repeatedly drawn red lines and then crossed them. So when Mr. Putin says, I'm not going to use nuclear weapons now, is that his next step or the step after the next step? I think we're moving in that direction. And this could ultimately be more than a minor incident in history. But finally, I know that, there are people in Israel who are talking about using nuclear weapons against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Are we making the world safer for ourselves and our friends, or are we doing the opposite?
Now, I'm going to get to what Putin said in a minute, and something else that you sent me from on an email the other day. I definitely want to share with people, but kind of continuing on down that wrong path. Here's what Jack Keane said, that in giving the voice to something that a lot of people are saying, this is what we should be doing even more in Ukraine.
The administration isn't coming clean about what's actually happening here. You see that bright red area there across from Ukraine? That is where we can fire HIMARS, or what they call guided multiple rocket launchers, into that. That's 75 kilometers into that. But see all the gray area outside of that? That's the Russian sanctuary where we cannot fire. That's all Russian territory. All the air bases that Russia is using to bomb Ukraine are largely in that area. Those are those little white circles there. Their ground bases, their logistic bases are all in that area. And the administration has told Ukraine they cannot fire the weapons that we've given them. That is absolutely makes no sense. And it's really handcuffing them in their ability to protect their own people, but also in their ability to bring down the military capability that Russia has. Ukraine, we can turn the tide in their favor, and the administration has got to stop handicapping them.
Now, I'll tell you what, well, there's many things that trouble me about that, but I think it was in March of this year, Jim Sciutto of CNN broke a story that in the fall of 2022, we had a lot of intelligence that Russia was on the cusp of using tactical nuclear weapons at that time because of the setbacks they'd had in Kherson, in Kharkiv City. And apparently we had to do a lot of crazy diplomacy, directly talking with Russia, with China, whatever, to get them to not do it. Things calmed down. So just at the possibility, not the possibility, just at the losing of some of the Russian-Ukrainian territory, they were on the cusp of that. Now you have guys like Jack Keane that say, we want to keep going on more and more. We want Russia to lose, etc., completely oblivious to what Vladimir Putin says. What Putin says like this.
Time and again, the West is using its tired propaganda cliches, but they're clearly ineffective in realizing its goals, including in Asia. This confrontational policy pursued by the United States to expand its military infrastructure in the region goes hand in hand in the growing scale of military exercises involving South Korea, Japan, and there are clearly hostile with regard to the DPRK. Such steps undermine peace and stability on the peninsula and threaten the security of all the countries in Southeast Asia.
So he recognizes that I mean, he talked about, how we're being tried and cliches and being aggressive. I mean, all the things that we see on the map, and that's saying it from Pyongyang when he's talking about that, which is, again, going back to this New World Order. How do you see that?
It's appropriate to remember that the same argument that General Keane is making was made by Douglas MacArthur, who was told that not to do it, who went ahead and did it. He was in office, and he provoked the Chinese intervention in Korea, which he didn't believe would happen. He thought, oh, the Chinese are bluffing, and we're taking the position the Russians are bluffing. I don't see much evidence of bluffing on the part of the Russians. And I think when you get a warning from somebody like Vladimir Putin, if you think he's a madman, you should take his warning seriously. If you think he's not a madman, but a rational actor who chooses his words carefully, which I do, you should take his warning seriously. And what you should not do is dismiss it. And so we are in the danger of making the same mistake we made in Korea, taking a proxy war, on the Korean Peninsula, and transforming it into a broader war between superpowers. Now, China in those days was ragtag and had no ability to attack us. We then threatened China with nuclear weapons. Guess what they did? They built their own nuclear arsenal. What we're doing is playing with disaster. This is a march of folly, and it has to end.
And I think to underscore your concern there, to share with our audience, you sent me an email a couple of days ago about a comment that a Russian figure is talking about on this issue of nuclear escalation, which I found personally alarming because he talks about, and one of the things he specifically says, Gary, if you can throw that call out up there in this article that he wrote, he said that, the question of the interviewer says, you have written that global war can only be prevented through the greater reliance on nuclear deterrence, fear, inspiring, sobering up. You insist that this will require a lowering of the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. And then Sergei Karaganov response is the United States is 100 times more vulnerable than we are in the use of any nuclear weapons, including the nuclear ones. The President Putin spoke about this, and I'm going to show exactly what he said here in a minute. Therefore, the use of non-nuclear weapons by someone against the United States targets abroad is one of the stages of escalation. Incidentally, there are several more stages of escalation before this step is taken. What do you take away from his comments there?
Well, I think this is exactly what I've been saying, that we're going through a graduated response from the Russians. Just imagine that somebody had fired the equivalent of ATACMS at Miami Beach from Cuba, or that the Mexicans had fired something onto Padre Island in Texas. What would our reaction be? We are not behaving intelligently. The risks we are accumulating are far too great.
And tell us a little bit about the fellow that wrote this. Is he just somebody in Russia?
Sergei Karaganov is the former head of the Russian Council on Foreign and Defense Affairs. He is a longtime advisor to Vladimir Putin. He had a discussion, he moderated a discussion at the St. Petersburg conference recently, where Mr. Putin was a panelist, a speaker. It was clear that Putin and he do not agree on the issue of nuclear weapons, and Mr. Putin cautioned him and said, basically, we're not going to that stage now. Didn't say we're never going to that stage. So Sergei Karaganov is forward-leaning on the use of nuclear weapons. Why? because he believes the West has basically forgotten what is at stake, and we have to be sobered up. That's what the paragraph you just put up showed. He's not alone in Russia. He is not alone. Nuclear deterrence, fear-inspiring, sobering up. Yes, this is his point.
And one of the things he right there, he said the president spoke about this. Here is what President Putin, I guess a little bit before this happened, here's what he did say.
Американцы – единственная страна, Соединенные Штаты, которая использовала ядерное оружие во Второй мировой войне. Хиросима, Нагасаки – 20 килотонн. Наше тактическое ядерное оружие – 70-75 килотонн. Это такое ядерное тактическое оружие. Давайте не доводить не только до использования, а даже до угрозы использования. На Западе считают, что Россия никогда этого не использует. У нас же есть ядерная доктрина. Посмотрите, что написано. Если чьи-то действия будут угрожать нашему суверенитету и территориальной целостности, мы считаем для себя возможным использовать все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Нельзя относиться к этому легко, поверхностно. Нужно относиться профессионально.
So again, he reiterates his willingness to use it if conditions are certain conditions are met, which he says, by his definition, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Russia. But where is that line that we don't know? But again, you said it a second ago by saying he's just bluffing. He'll never mean it, which, many in the United States do, especially General Hodges is a famous one for saying there's zero chance he'll ever do that. He's self-deterred. And I hear that from a lot of quarters. And what do you say to that?
I say that it is a risk not worth taking. There's some questions that you should not want to ever have the answer to. And, because the consequences of getting the wrong answer are so great. Now, the Russians have multiple options with regard to nuclear weapons. They could fire a nuclear armed missile at their own territory. They could find a no man's land internationally, somewhere in the Pacific, perhaps, or even an old abandoned U.S. test site, and fire at that. They could use tactical nuclear weapons against a concentration of Ukrainian or foreign forces in Ukraine. We are coming up against another escalation issue because the F-16s that we have supplied to Ukraine are nuclear capable. And the Russians have said they will treat them as such. How do they know what is being fired at them before it lands and explodes? Is something like the attack on the beach at Sevastopol responsible action on our part? Does it suggest that we are engaged in restraint? I don't think so. So I think this is actually very foolish. And as I say, it reminds me, people are talking about it, reminding them of 1914 and World War I. I think it's more like the bringing on the Chinese intervention in Korea. They'd never do that. We're so powerful. They'd never take us on. Well, tell it to the Marines at the Chosun Reservoir.
Right. Yeah, and that is the thing that worries me the most, because as I just showed in that long string of our senior officials, from the president on down, Secretary of Defense, to all these other senior State Department, Defense Department officials, doesn't give a lot of confidence that we're even thinking about moving in the right direction. All of this just continues to seem that it's going to cause the world to be shifting away from us. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how other people in the world are viewing all this, and like the global South or others in the Middle East or in Asia. How are they viewing it? Those who are not directly Western countries.
Well, we have a lot of access to thinking from the global majority, the global South, if you will. a lot of commentary, and it's not very a good reading from an American point of view. Some of them think we're nuts. Others think that we're just stupid, but they don't admire our statecraft anymore. Are we? Do we have a strategy? Where is it? What's the proposal for achieving anything worthwhile in these conflicts? I think the war in Gaza has done more damage to us than anything else because we look like utter hypocrites. We are full partners in genocide. And the whole world sees that. And when we deny that and continue to supply the weapons to conduct the genocide to Israel, we disgrace ourselves. We disgrace ourselves. I spent 30 years serving the country. I don't believe we should ever disgrace ourselves.
Well, very well said. Last question I got for you is, where could this go? Let's say that we somehow avoid nuclear escalation anywhere. Even if we avoid the most catastrophic outcome, what is the risk to the United States in the medium and long term if we keep on the current course we're on?
Well, we're losing our global primacy. But nobody's talking about attacking the United States. You know, I remember once talking to Newt Gingrich, who told me a story about how he was talking to a fellow member of Congress. And he asked this guy what his priorities were. And he said, I want to up the defense budget. And Newt Gingrich said, well, who are you going to defend against? Who do you think is going to attack the United States? The Jamaicans?
Maybe Haiti. I don't know.
Haiti, yeah. Well, and basically, we don't have a defense department. We have an offense department. And maybe we should have a defense department. Maybe we should take care of ourselves rather than running around the world trying to butt in on everyone else's business and threaten people, whether it's with sanctions or other coercive measures or the use of force. Let's look at the record in the post-Cold War era. China hasn't invaded anybody. How many people have we invaded? Was Grenada, really a threat to the United States? Did we have to go in and kill a lot of Panamanians to take Noriega? And so forth and so on. Did we have to conduct a bombing campaign in Yugoslavia to separate Kosovo from it? We have been very aggressive, and I don't see that level of aggression on the other side. I think the Russians have clearly broken international law, and they've done terrible things in Ukraine, no doubt. So you were part of a debacle in Iraq. I would say the first Gulf War was a good one. The second one was not. And we suffered the consequences. And if we had played our card, if we had had a strategy in Afghanistan instead of just an attitude, we might have accomplished something. We need a strategy. I don't see either of the presidential candidates providing that. Right. That disturbs me.
Yeah. That's kind of how I feel. One of my big frustrations. I would love it to be able to highlight, if this person here were to take over, things could be better. But there's just not many of those to even point to, and certainly none of the ones that are running right now. But I guess we'll just have to leave it there for the current time. We're going to continue to monitor this and watch it. And look, as we say a lot, even if the information is ugly, the truth is ugly, we're going to tell the people the truth. And we're going to keep putting that out there. So at least if nothing else, we can put pressure on some of our officials to start doing the right thing and change course.
What they ought to do is think.
Yeah, not a lot of that. A lot of reaction and just, mocking whatever, because I guess that seems to work for them here inside. But be that as it may, we're going to continue on. And we very much thank you for coming on today to provide this very sober analysis about the way things are and where we're going. So no one can claim that we didn't know what was happening in the future. So at the very least for that, we thank you for coming on. And we also have John Mearsheimer on today. Later, we're going to talk in a different element of this, where some of the leaders are impotent, and they're bringing us to the escalation risk for war, both in the Middle East and in Russia. We're going to be looking at that later this afternoon. Be sure and join us for that, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.